everybody. Certainly glad you're here. I'm Lois Winter from the Historical Committee of York County welcomes you. And as Dave said, please take a brochure and make sure you see all the things that are coming up. I'll give one little plug. If you come back 3 o'clock on Sunday, Michael Moore will be here. If you know Michael Moore, he is a curator for Lee Hall Mansion and Enview. And he's an expert on the Battle of the Peninsula campaign. He knows details like nobody else. So he will be here telling all those details 3 o'clock on Sunday. But I'm here to introduce Dr. Green, Jim Green, who has this interesting background because he's director of NASA's Planetary Science and Robotic Missions of Exploration to other planets in the solar system. So with that background, he's also a history person. So isn't that great? Today at lunch we learned we learned something about Mars and Jupiter and the rings of Saturn, and now we're going to learn about the Civil War from exactly the same person. And he told me very clearly I'm not supposed to take too much of his time. So I'm really happy to introduce Jim Green.
Well, today we're going to talk about Civil War balloons. But before we get into the Civil War, let me put a little bit of it in context. Balloons were all the rage in the early 1800s. This was really the forefront of aviation. It was the forefront of the fantasies and fiction that was coming out about what you could do in balloons, and it was just a wonderful time. Newspapers talked about daring flights. But what was the problem with the balloons is as an aviation start, not many people knew what to do with balloons. Really, the thinking about how they could be applied and where they could go and what could happen to them wasn't really there. Balloons were typically manned by what I would call showmen. They really were the barnstormers of the era in the early to mid-1850s. You would go to fairs, or you would go to 4th of July celebration and you'd get a tethered balloon ride, or you'd spend 50 cents and watch the balloon get inflated. And so most of the population was pretty familiar with balloons, and it was really an exciting time. But just before the Civil War, a transatlantic cable was put in place between the United States and England. It didn't last very long. In a matter of days, the transatlantic cable was dead. But it began a new era of communication with Europe. Fast communication, where you could move information from the United States to Europe in a matter of a day or two from a balloon flight versus crossing the Atlantic, became a major topic to aeronauts. And in fact, quite a few aeronauts signed up to the idea that they will develop a balloon that has the capability of crossing the Atlantic. This really caught the eye of many, many investors. And so many large amounts of money were spent on developing balloons. Here's one. This is Thaddeus Lowe, who began his balloon career in actually about 1857 or so, just before the Civil War. And by 1858 and 1859, he was pretty well known, had made a number of flights, and he was one of those aeronauts that signed up for the crazy idea of crossing the Atlantic in a balloon. And this is the city of New York. 725,000 cubic feet of gas went into this balloon. And it would literally lift many tons, 22 tons. And so it had gondolas, and it could carry men, and it had a boat that if it really needed to come down, and if something happened, it could actually complete the journey. Well, Lowe did get investors, and Lowe did build this balloon. He failed in a number of attempts, but in his desire to cross the Atlantic, he ended up talking to many major scientists like Joseph Henry, who was heading the Smithsonian down in Washington, D.C. So Joseph Henry is considered the United States scientist, and he was a consultant to Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln advised Lowe to come down to Washington, D.C. at the beginning of the war after Lincoln was elected, and to prove what he could do for supporting the war effort in the Union. And so Lowe did that. He came down to the Washington, D.C. area and decided he could do a demonstration on the Mall. Now, this is a recreation of that demonstration on the Mall that occurred last year at just about 150-year anniversary. And this demonstration was all about going up in this balloon, a tethered balloon, about 500 feet. And then what? Well, Lowe was a master showman. He wanted all the attention he could get. And so he decided the best thing to do was take a telegraph up with him. He got 2 telegraph operators to come, string a wire to the balloon. He only went up 500 feet because that's all the wire they had with them. He could have gone up higher. He hired some local soldiers to come and help him pull up the balloon, tether the balloon. And so he indeed, from the Mall, goes up to 500 feet with these 2 telegraph operators, and he sends a telegraph, the very first telegraph from a balloon. And who does he send it to? Well, Abraham Lincoln. And here's pretty much the view that he would have. Kurt Westergaard, who has been in the area using his small little tethered balloon, taking pictures at high altitudes and looking around, came to the Mall during this event, took this picture. And so you can see what Lowe would see at 500 feet, virtually in the same location. You can actually see the Washington Monument, and off to the right, the extreme right of this picture, although it's hidden by trees, is indeed the White House. And so Lowe sends this telegram. This is actually a copy of the telegram. And here's what the telegram said. There's a couple important points about the telegraph. And so it's to the President of the United States, June 16, 1861. This point of observation commands an area of nearly 50 miles in diameter. Now that led you to believe that from even 500 feet you could see 50 miles. Well, that was a lie. You can't really do that. At about 1,000 feet you have a great view of about 15 miles. But this is very symptomatic of Lowe and his type of personality. He would go to lengths to exaggerate, to make a point, or to get what he wanted to get done. And of course, he wanted to be the head aeronaut. Lincoln got the telegram, invited Lowe over to the White House that night. Lowe towed the balloon back to the back of the White House and had it tethered there. Lincoln came out and looked at it. Some reports are that Lincoln got in the basket. He never got in the basket. He never went up in the balloon. But, he did take a good look at it. And he and Lowe had dinner that night and with a number of other guests. And the guests couldn't stay any longer. They talked way into the night, and they finally left. And finally, late in the evening, Lowe stayed at the White House and was invited to breakfast with Lincoln to carry on with the conversation. And of course, I am sure Thaddeus Lowe is in cell mode. He's had plenty of time. He's got Lincoln's ear. And indeed, not too long after that, Thaddeus Lowe becomes the head aeronaut of the Union Army. And Lincoln really loved this idea. And so did McClellan, who was his general at the time during the summer of 1861. McClellan really saw a couple other demonstrations, had several of his generals go up in the balloon. In fact, McClellan went up once in the balloon and took a wild ride. He didn't like it. And in fact, at the end of his ride, he got out of the balloon and then threw up. And he made sure no one around him said anything. And that only was revealed in a letter from one of his generals to another individual, and it's in an archive at Yale. Webb wrote the letter and laughed about it 20 years later. Lowe had carte blanche. He could do no wrong. And so he asked for money from the government to build a series of balloons, and he got it. This is the Union. This is the first balloon he built. He completed it by the end of September 1861. As you can see, it's a beautifully ornamented. It had a big name on it called Union, and it had Lowe was very patriotic, so he had flags on it and eagles and everything. He also recognized that he needed to be patriotic in these balloons because at times he was fired on by Union troops, not knowing that he was a Union observer. And so consequently, in many cases, he'd go up in his gondola and actually have a flag or two flags flying out of his gondola, making sure that everyone below him knew he was a Union balloonist and not to fire on him. So Lowe learned a lot and implemented those things as he went along. Now, he would take these balloons and they would go up 1,000 feet. They had typically 3 lines, sometimes 4. Lowe insisted on that because with one line, if you go up with one line, not only is it a single point failure, as we say in NASA, but it is also very susceptible to spinning. So when the wind blows around the balloon and you only have that one line, that one tethered line, the balloon will spin, and it's very hard to make any sort of stable observations from a spinning balloon. Lowe learned that early on, so he made sure that these balloons were stable, and he did that with 3 or 4 lines. He also recognized that because these had the purpose of staying put in weather, whether it was raining, whether it was snowing, whether it was hot or very inclement weather, that they needed to be rugged, and so he got the best silk he could. They're double silked. The seams are sewn in a very special way. He developed a coating on these balloons that once the gas that he used, and it was not hot air, and we'll talk a little bit about what kind of gas he used, but the gas that he would use could easily leak out of these balloons, and so he literally invented a coating on the balloons that kept this hydrogen gas that he would put in the balloons sealed for days, weeks, and in some cases nearly a month. So once he inflated these balloons, they could stay inflated for nearly a month and still provide tremendous use. After he built the Union, of course, he charged the government $1,500 for this balloon. I'm sure he made money, too. He was a contractor. He wanted to be a civil servant. He wanted to have a commission, but that was not to be. He was always afraid if he ever got captured by the Confederacy in some accident, his balloon blew over and ended up in the Confederacy, they would shoot him as a spy. And in fact, there were several reports in newspapers that that's exactly what they would do if they could get a hold of Thaddeus Lowe. So this particular balloon, the Union, is a class that's the big one. It's the 32,000 cubic feet, 32,000, you know. Whereas the city of New York is 20 times more gas in that balloon than this one. So Lowe was very used to building huge balloons. The next one he built was the Intrepid. The Intrepid was a very famous balloon. There's a number of pictures of the Intrepid that were taken by Brady's groups. Now the Intrepid on one side not only has its name, but the opposite side, it has a picture of McClellan. So this is a very famous picture of McClellan, and well known, of course, the troops love McClellan, and Thaddeus Lowe, of course, is playing to his strengths, and of course playing to McClellan's vanity, if you will, to make sure that he always was in good graces. Now, as a civil servant, he really didn't understand the military very well. The balloon corps was put in under the topographical engineers. The idea is, well, we'll get our balloons up early on as we move forward in any movement. The balloons would be at the forefront. They wouldn't be behind, they'd be at the forefront. And they'd send up topographical engineers and they would create maps. They would develop what they needed to, strategies in terms of next approaches and what roads they could use. And so it made sense to put them in topographical engineers. Well, Lowe never went to a topographical engineer for anything. He would always go to the highest general he could to get what he wanted. The letters from Lowe to McClellan and back and forth, and are numerous, and Lowe would just walk into McClellan's tent and ask for things and get it. And so he asked also for more money. Here's another balloon. This is also a little smaller. It's called the Constitution. It has the Freedom Statue, which is actually the statue that sits on top of the Capitol now. Some caricature of that on the other side of the balloon. He also built the United States. This is also in the class of the large class. And then he built a series of smaller balloons. So the United States could carry 3 men along with 4 cables up to the 1,000-foot marker. He built the Washington. The Washington actually is also another famous balloon like the Intrepid. There are many times where balloon observations are communicated, and it's known that they came from the Washington balloon. This is a smaller balloon, a 2-man balloon. He charged the government $1,200 to build this one. And he had the face of George Washington on it, and Washington on the other side. He built the Excelsior. Okay, now these were very small balloons, 1-man balloons. He inflated these very quickly and get them up right away. And he also built the Eagle. So those are the 7 Civil War balloons that he built. And of course, you notice these aren't army drab gray and green. You know, they're not meant to blend into the sky. They are meant to be showy. And the reason why is very simple. Lowe wanted anyone on the ground, if they saw the balloon, to think, if you can see me, I can see you. And he used that quite effectively in intimidation. The Confederate Army, in many cases and in many different instances, would take back roads, would go out of their way to make large maneuvers such that they would be not seen from balloons. And that was their approach. Now Lowe also knew that he needed to get these inflated out in the field. That means you couldn't go to the local gas works. Okay, at that time, when we came in this room, we turned on the lights. But 150 years ago, if you came into this room, you would turn on a little valve, gas would come out, and you would light that lamp. You would have city gas. This would be coal that would be burnt, coal and peat that would be burnt in a plant. And some of the gas that would be liberated would be carbonated hydrogen that would be stored in a tank and then pumped out into the city. So Lowe could go to a city gas works and inflate his balloon with city gas, and that was great. But when he's out in the field, he really needed the capability to have the inflation, and he did that by developing gas generators. He made 12 gas generators, maybe 14. I'm not quite sure of the number. At least 12. Here are 2 of them, right down on the wall, as you can see. How they worked was you poured in iron filings. These came from the Navy Yard as they were making guns and doing boring and everything else, the big guns. They create the iron filings. And a dilute solution of sulfuric acid. And this is, you put that together and you get an exothermic reaction, that's what the chemists call it, and you end up pulling the oxygen out of the water, liberating the hydrogen. The oxygen's H2O. You get the hydrogen, and then you can cool it off and actually stick it in the balloon. So he generated hydrogen in the field. And he tried to patent these, but he didn't make the patent. They don't exist anymore, but we do know a lot about them because there is quite a set of material about them and a defunct patent. While he was building the balloons up in Philadelphia, he'd go back and forth to Washington, D.C., and on the train, he thought of another idea. He also needed to deploy these balloons at various locations. And he decided the best way to do that is using the Potomac, using the river. And so he created this sketch. This is an actual sketch that Lowe made. It shows on the right some Navy ship pulling what looks like a barge, some sort of barge that's been flat-topped. And indeed, he went to McClellan, asked to make that barge into an aircraft carrier. McClellan loved the idea, provided funding, and in the Navy Yard they built it. Now this was named Actually, the barge was a former vessel called the George Washington Parke Custis. It was in the Custis family at one time, and the Navy ended up acquiring it. And they were going to use it as a coal barge. They'd stripped off the superstructure and they were going to put coal in it, and they were going to take the coal from the Navy Yard out to the Potomac, where the big ships would come up and get their coal. They couldn't come up the Anacostia where the Navy Yard was, so they needed to get the coal out to the ships. So they needed coal barges. So they had just acquired this. Lowe went out to the Navy Yard in Dahlgren, and he decided this is what they wanted to do. And for a little money, they flat-topped it, and Lowe had an aircraft carrier. So he's really getting outfitted, isn't he? Lowe also, everywhere he went, needed a detail of men. Okay? Lowe didn't have a corps of men that just were balloonists, other than a handful. He had a set 5 or 6 men that were permanently stationed with him. But whenever they went out in the field, they would use the local forces to be able to have a set of men that would then be trained on how to inflate the balloon, how to send it up. And here's 30 men, 10 on each line, and they're raising Lowe. This turns out to be on the Gainesville farm, and that's how they, through these tethers, raised and lowered the balloons by a detail of 30 or 40 servicemen. Now, Lowe learned pretty quickly, early on in the war, as he was moving into Virginia and observing what was happening in Fairfax Courthouse and a number of other locations, that he could be fired on. In fact, he was fired on constantly. This is a very great little sketch. It shows what happens in a balloon as you leave the trees and start being seen by the enemy. They fire on you, and they fire cannons, and for about 300 feet, first 300 feet is really a danger zone. And there's many reports of cannon shells were going between the basket that you're standing in and the balloon itself. So many near misses, and in the Civil War, the balloons had about 3,000 flights, and these aeronauts that Lowe had hired to help man all the balloons were fired on constantly. And so between November 1861 and March 1862, Lowe had an array of balloons stretching up the Potomac at Edwards Ferry all the way down to Bud's Ferry. Now this was very important. It kept what I feel is a major strategy that Lincoln had in particular of keeping some semblance of knowledge about the safety of Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C., as you know, at the beginning of the war, was almost surrounded by the Confederacy. You know, Southern Maryland was very pro-South. Virginia seceded. Lincoln went out of his way to keep Maryland in the South, or D.C. would be completely surrounded. And one of the strategies that Lincoln had is to make sure Washington, D.C. was safe by having these balloons. This worked marvelously, okay? And the reason why was, from a balloon you could see 15 to 20 miles at 1,000 feet, and it takes an army 1 day to move that distance. So from these balloons, you could observe an army approaching, and you'd have about a day's warning. You could also tell what roads they're using, and so many other things, so quickly. I mean, there are scouts running around, and they can gather information, but from balloons, you could actually observe from afar and gather the information quickly, and that was one of their key aspects, was reconnaissance. And so by March 1862, Lincoln was putting enough pressure on McClellan to get something going that McClellan's plan of go on to Richmond began. So in late March, McClellan began to move his forces down to Fortress Monroe and move up the peninsula, which of course is girded by the York and James River. And the idea was he'd bring 120,000 men or more if he could, and march them into Richmond, right up through the peninsula. Now the first thing McClellan did was send a balloon down there. He had Thaddeus Lowe send one of his balloons down to Fortress Monroe. The reason why is he wanted personally to know where the Virginia was. You know, in early March, the famous battle between the Monitor and the Merrimack occurred. The Virginia. And so he wanted to know personally what was happening, because he's going to bring a lot of men down there that, of course, the Virginia could take out so easily as an ironclad. Now, you know, the Navy's making those observations. The Navy's quite concerned about that. The Navy wants to confine the Virginia to the Elizabeth River. The Navy doesn't want the Virginia to go into the Chesapeake and up to the Potomac and shell Washington, D.C., which was a major fear. And so the Navy was quite concerned about that. But you know, McClellan had his own reasons for that. And so Lowe sends a balloon down there with one of his aeronauts, Ebenezer Seaver. And Seaver has a very difficult time. The balloon observations don't come quite as rapidly as he would like. But McClellan moves out and moves his men down and embarks. Brings also Lowe and Porter and Franklin and a whole series of other corps that he has, as many men as he can take from Washington, D.C. he can get, and moves them down. And so as they begin that process and end up in Fortress Monroe, and because the roads were so bad, so muddy, and you move 100,000 men over them, or even 60 or 70,000 men over them, at this time anyway, they were very difficult to move from Fortress Monroe even up to Yorktown. This, of course, gave the Confederacy an enormous amount of time to prepare for that. And Magruder, as many know, many in this area know, are very familiar with using Yorktown as that anchor, had a series of embattlements and redoubts all the way across the peninsula, and in fact made sure by using the York River. And so here's Yorktown, as you can see in the upper right part of the picture, and behind that is the Confederate line. The York River cuts through there and becomes no man's land, and the Union Army comes up and creates its own series of mounds for protection. And here's where the balloon, the first balloon is put. It's near the sawmill, and in fact a couple of us were out today looking at where that site might be. Now, in addition to that, Lowe brings out to Cheesemans Creek the G.W. Parke Custis. So he brings that up along with a lot of the supplies that he needs. And so it's easy for anyone in the balloon camp to come over to the G.W. Parke Custis and get some more iron filings and be able to continue keeping the balloon going. This was working great, and this happened very early on. And so the balloon was up and going either late April 5th or early April 6th. So they had just made it to the Yorktown area. Once again, the balloon was right up front in the court. And the balloon that Lowe initially inflated was the Excelsior. It's a one-man balloon. It's a very easy balloon to get up. With the gas generators, you can get it inflated in about 45 minutes. And he was given a detail of the 4th Maine. So the 4th Maine, 30 men from the 4th Maine were trained, and it takes several weeks to get these guys up to speed on all the intricacies of filling balloons and tethering and moving them and watching out for various hazards with them. And so this was a very green group, so to speak. They were trying to learn their trade. And no sooner did this balloon station get up and running, and Lowe receives an order from McClellan: give me another balloon station. And that brings up a very interesting occurrence that I want to talk about, and we call it the Porter's Free Ascent. Now here's the map, a great map. It's out of the official records, where you can see battlements, Yorktown stretching across the peninsula. You can see we're about lined where the first balloon camp was. And Lowe was to set up another balloon camp at Warwick Courthouse. Well, Lowe had the balloon down at Fortress Monroe. It was the Constitution. And he felt the best thing he could do was go down to Fortress Monroe and bring up the Constitution. Although he actually had several uninflated balloons in the GW Park Custis, he chose not to go that way. He also needed a couple of portable gas generators, which came by another transport. So he goes, Lowe goes down to Fortress Monroe, and so he needed another aeronaut. And just before he left to go to the peninsula, he hires an aeronaut, James Allen. And James is a post-war picture sketch of James is there. James Allen is a die-hard aeronaut. Did aeronautics almost his whole life. He's just a fabulous aeronaut, and he's really one of the stalwarts in the balloon corps. Not much is known about him because he didn't write much. A lot is known about Lowe because Lowe writes a lot, and even if it's wrong, he writes a lot, and he did that quite frequently. So Allen now comes into the balloon camp, and he is assigned to go up in the morning of April 11th. And at the night before, on April 10th, McClellan has his favorite general come see him, and that's Fitzjohn Porter. And he gives Porter a verbal order, and that is, I want you to examine the guns facing the York River in Yorktown and at Gloucester. That was very important because McClellan was developing a strategy to work with the Navy to run by Yorktown. And if he ran by Yorktown, you could cut off the supplies coming from West Point and a number of locations bringing supplies down to Yorktown. You could cut off the Yorktown-Williamsburg Road by having the Navy watch them. And he devised the idea of having a balloon station at Warwick Courthouse to see the vulnerability of the line on that end of the peninsula of the Yorktown line, so that he could bring men around, break through the line, surround Yorktown, and capture it. This was a very early strategy that he had. Porter was very vested in that. And in the morning, at dawn, on April 11th, out of the shadows comes a figure up to the 4th Main. The order is to prepare the balloon. And this gentleman gets in the balloon. It turns out it's Porter. Fitzjohn Porter made it to the balloon before Allen did. And Porter orders the balloon to go aloft. One line is connected to the balloon. And as Porter goes up in this balloon, the Excelsior, early in that morning, at about 300 feet, the rope breaks. Now this balloon has got tremendous buoyancy. Porter is thrown at the bottom of the basket. The balloon goes up hundreds of feet. Porter is almost knocked senseless trying to figure out what happened and what he's going to do next. The balloon passes 1,000 feet. The balloon passes 2,000 feet. It is believed that the balloon makes 5,000 feet before it finally slows down. So this is very cold. It's very cold up at 5,000 feet. Porter picks himself up. Now, he'd been in Lowe's balloon many, many times, 30 or 40 times prior to coming down the peninsula, at least. And so Lowe and Porter were quite tight friends. And so Porter actually knew a lot about ballooning by just listening to Thaddeus Lowe. Now, he knew about air currents. He knew that there are air currents going east to west and west to east if you just got at the right altitude. And so he needed to be able to manage this balloon, and he needed to be able to manage the altitude. And that turns out to be done through a rip valve that's at the very top of the balloon. There's a line that comes from the top of the rip valve of the balloon, comes down into the basket, and if you pull that, you can vent some gas, you can come down to a different altitude, you can close the valve, you can see what the winds are like, and if the prevailing winds are such, that you then can actually sort of move the balloon in a particular direction. That's the best you can do in terms of guiding the balloon anywhere. So Porter immediately looked for the rip rope, didn't find it. And finally, as he looked up, he saw it way up in the netting of the basket. Porter climbs out of the car and climbs up the ropes and grabs the rib valve cord and sticks it in his mouth. His hands are freezing. He's literally can hardly move. He gets back in the basket and begins to use that, drops the balloon, and now he feels in control. Now what's happening below him is unbelievable. The knowledge that Porter is an aeronaut, somebody is in this balloon and it's moving freely, goes right through the camps. Thousands of men come out on the Union side. And because of that alerts the Confederates. Thousands of Confederates come out. Can you imagine 40, maybe 60,000 men looking out at what will happen to this balloon? Will it become a Confederate balloon or not? Now Porter finally gains his composure, pulls out his glasses, and begins to peer into Yorktown. And in fact, he makes his sketches, he looks at Gloucester, and he understands where the batteries are, and he's gonna make it back. That's his whole plan. And so once he gains his intelligence, he then pulls the ripcord again and comes down to another altitude, for which then the prevailing winds take him back to the Union lines. And as he finally feels comfortable and safe, he pulls the valve as hard as he can, venting as much gas as he can. And he also knew from talking with Lowe that the gas vents from the top first. And so as the whole bag collapses, almost looking like a mushroom, it forms a parachute. And so instead of dropping like a rock, it actually comes down at a much lower velocity, and he crashes into some of the tents that are there. This is a period sketch of Porter getting out of the balloon, and he tells one of the men that are there that he would have given his life rather than have given up this balloon. And he really loves the balloon corps. So he gets a horse, who goes over to McClellan, and he tells McClellan what he sees. And what he convinces McClellan is that if you can convince the Navy to run by Yorktown, doesn't look that formidable, then we can break this siege, which just started within a few days. I mean, the Confederacy is getting their act together. Magruder's trying to make a big scene such that he's trying to fool the Union Army that it's well protected and that he has far more men than he really does. Even though McClellan believed that there's far more men, McClellan had this strategy to try to take it before he really had to do a siege with it. So Porter was really convinced that we could do this if we now join with the Navy and break through the line and capture Yorktown. But something else happens on April 11th. The Virginia comes out of Gosport and up the Elizabeth River, comes into Hampton Roads, and brings with him several vessels and begins to threaten the Monitor. The Monitor is sitting off of Fortress Monroe and has been ordered not to move, not to engage. Do not engage. Now, this would have been the second major battle of two ironclads. The Virginia there is taunting the Merrimack. Now, it didn't want to come too close because it didn't want to come under the guns of Fortress Monroe. So it really wanted the Merrimack, the Virginia really wanted the Monitor to come out and play. And they actually captured a couple of vessels, sunk another vessel. They were wreaking havoc in Hampton Roads. But in the end, the Monitor didn't leave, and the Virginia went back to the Elizabeth River. But this really scared the Navy. And so not too long after this event, Goldsborough, heading the commander of the Navy in the Hampton Road area in Missouri, and McClellan had a meeting about running up the York River. Well, the Navy didn't want anything to do with that. They needed to be where they were, and it was clear they demonstrated being where they were prevented the Virginia from getting into the Chesapeake and going up. So that ended the strategy. It changed from breaking the beginning of a siege to a long siege. And so as Lowe continued to make observations from both those balloon stations, the Confederacy did too. The Confederacy wanted to know what Lowe was up to. And of course, many here should be very familiar. If you're not, I'm delighted to tell you the story of John Randolph. Now, Joe Johnston came down to Lee Hall, where his made his headquarters, and he sent an order to Magruder, who was over in the at that time he was in the Yorktown area somewhere, that he needed a very knowledgeable soldier, someone that knew the area like the back of his hand. And he needed him for a special assignment. Now that came to Magruder's staff, and the first person that handled that order was John Randolph Bryan. He was on that staff. He read that order and he said, "That's me. Okay, I'm going to volunteer for this job." And he convinced Magruder to let him do that. And he goes over and meets Joe Johnston, and Johnston quizzes him. Do you know about this road and that? And how long have you been in the area? And on and on and on. And finally is convinced by Bryan that he is the man. And of course, then he tells Bryan, "Well, I need you to be an aeronaut. We have a balloon that we've acquired, and this particular balloon we don't know much about. Confederate records are very sketchy. We have a few tantalizing glimpses of where it may have come from, but it's a cotton balloon. It's not like those silk balloons, and it's designed to be a hot air balloon. And a hot air balloon, if you get hot air in it, that's lighter than air, pops the balloon up, and you go up for a little while. But without heating the air, you're going to come down. So we're talking tens of minutes versus Lowe's balloons, which could be up for hours and days, literally. And so John was very upset with this idea, but finally was ordered to do it, and indeed, he made 2 ascensions right off the bat, one right after the other, April 13 and 14. His orders were, in these daytime ascensions, to look at the Union strength, and in particular the location of their artillery, because they knew as McClellan was bringing up his siege guns from Fortress Monroe, they needed to know, when will McClellan be ready to level Yorktown? And the longer they can put that off, the more the Confederacy has an opportunity to organize, bring Jackson from the valley, and really be able to put up a fight, because they knew McClellan wasn't going to be around Yorktown forever. Although he would have been if you let him. He wasn't one that usually moved very fast. Bryan's 3rd flight, and he was ordered late on the night of the 15th, and it's perhaps the early morning of the 16th that he went up. This was a night flight. There were rumors that there were movements in the Union Army going on, and Johnston wanted to know where those movements were. Where is the Union fortifying? Because that might be a location where they are then massing to punch through the line. And so John got in the balloon after it was inflated and was ready to go. This was a really exciting thing. Men were all around him looking, in addition to those that he was depending on to work the balloon. They went up, the Confederate balloon went up with one line. Now, although there's a disadvantage with one line, the only advantage to it is with 4 lines, you're actually taking the weight of the rope up with you, all right? And so you really needed to have a lot of buoyancy. Now, with one line, you had much less buoyancy that you needed to do. And of course, with a hot air balloon, you needed to lighten it as much as you could. And so one rope was really their best compromise to get it up. So Bryant was ready to get in the balloon. He got in the balloon and up he went. And then the coil of rope was laying on the side. And a soldier got his leg caught as the rope was being played out. And his friend, that soldier's friend, took an axe and cut the rope. And the same thing happened to Bryant as happened to Fitzjohn Porter only 5 days earlier. And that is that balloon rocketed up. Now, it probably went maybe 1,000, maybe 1,500 feet. But of course, it knocked him down to the bottom of the basket. He's written about this in several articles. That he literally threw up. He was very shaken by this. But indeed, from his explanation of what happened, he finally became composed as to what was going on and made those observations. And in the meantime, the balloon was losing its buoyancy, and as it was coming down, he could hear the rope dangling in the York River as it was going upstream, and knew that he was pretty close to going in the York River. So he actually started to take his clothes off. And he didn't want to, and he had a heck of a time taking his boots off. I think he cut one of them off at least. But the wind eventually took him on land. He crash landed, put his clothes back on, and was able to go back to Joe Johnston and let him know what he saw. Now, in his writings, he told Joe Johnston that across from Dam Number 1, it looks like the Union Army is amassing. And indeed, on the 16th, just hours later, the Union forces made a movement and tried to break through the lines. Actually, they did make it across the Warwick River, busted into the lines, and then a counterattack pushed them back. And that was one of the nice little back and forths that go on between the two armies. But they both then settled down for many more days of siege. And as the end of the month was coming, this particular balloon went up one more time at the end of the month. Now, Bryant didn't do it because he had plenty of opportunity to write about this. The appearance of this balloon on April 29th is well documented in several northern newspapers. No reference to who was in it, what happened. But it's for sure that it was designed to be able, once again, to look at the artillery and once again get an assessment of when McClellan was going to pummel Yorktown in the siege. And so McClellan had made plans to do that. He was ready, and on May 5th was the date they were targeting to actually level Yorktown. So on May 3rd, 2 days earlier, the rebels started shelling everything they could. In fact, when the balloon went up on the 3rd, as it usually did every day, or nearly every day, they really tried to knock it down. And in fact, Lowe became rather unnerved with that, and not much observations were done that day. But that was, of course, done to hide what was going on. They were collecting supplies to be burned if they couldn't move. They were getting ready to move out. And indeed, on the early morning of May 4th, they started evacuating Yorktown. So, how did we know that? Well, the first person that noticed that turned out to be General George Armstrong Custer. Custer was a staff member who he was very knowledgeable about the balloons after being up in those many times. He also had trouble with his first balloon flights and getting over his fear of heights. But he went up alone in the Constitution, which was at Warwick Courthouse, went up 1,000 feet, and watched the Confederates starting to leave Yorktown. And they were also burning ammo, and there were some explosions, and so that was also drawing his attention. And from the signal station, as depicted in a Harper's Ferry sketch, or maybe that's a New York Illustrated, the signal was sent over to McClellan's headquarters that indeed they were evacuating Yorktown. And here's Lowe and Heintzelman. They were ordered to go up. Now, Lowe had now, by that time, replaced the Excelsior, the smaller balloon, with a really big balloon, the Intrepid. And so could carry up quite a few officers, actually 5 men if you needed that. And so the two of them went up and indeed saw the evacuation of Yorktown. And of course, the next thing that happened is at the evacuation, the Union Army moved in. Lowe actually had his balloon towed over to the Yorktown area. And the next thing that Lowe was ordered to do was to move up the York River with Franklin's Corps. Franklin was ordered to bring up the ships, load his men up, and run up the York River to try to cut off the Confederates that are retreating. But they didn't actually get their act together until 7 days later. So several days later, so by May 7th, they started up the York River, and of course ended up at the Confederate White House. And there they disembarked. Here's Lowe. Here's another period sketch of Lowe getting his equipment moved onto land. And so Lowe and Stoneman, who's a cavalry officer, teamed up and they moved inward. They started moving into a variety of roads, and soon Lowe was able to establish a balloon station at Dr. Gaines's house. And that's shown in red. That was the first balloon station. The next thing, when McClellan started to bring up his force, he wanted another balloon station, and so the second balloon station that was established was near Mechanicsville. Now, between these two balloons, you had some beautiful views of Richmond, and you can look at a lot of the newspaper reports and many diaries and books that have come out that talk about the citizens coming out and seeing the Union balloons, and they were afraid because that's where the Union Army was. So the population of Richmond was very distraught because it was clear that the Union Army was on their doorstep. Now, at the Gainesville farm, Lowe needed water for the inflation. He usually stopped by streams. He loved ravines, or he loved tall trees that hid the inflation of his balloon or hid the location of his balloon, such that he got usually a good way up before he was noticed. This is a period Brady photograph that's done. This was actually staged. Lowe is standing by the balloon on the very far right, and he's a nice little black hat, and he's holding onto the netting. This is the 4th Maine that's still with them. You can actually see the Polite stream right behind them for the inflation. And so they were set. They had 2 wonderful balloon stations up, providing all sorts of intelligence. Things were going great, and of course many battles occurred on the peninsula. This is the Battle of Farrells. It's well known that the balloons were up. Lowe's balloon also carried one of these telegraphs and telegraph operators. And this is a fabulous occasion for which Lowe and Parker Springs watched the battle. And then Springs, through the telegraph, sent the messages down to McClellan's headquarters that were then relayed back to Washington, D.C. And in the war room is Lincoln and Stanton listening to what was going on 160 miles away, the Battle of Farrells on May 31st. So that was really an exciting time. It hit the press all over the place. Well, soon after that battle, and I was what I would say was kind of a stalemate. Not much really happened. A lot of men were lost, of course. McClellan decided to move more of his men across the Chickahominy and set up another balloon station at the Trent House, and he does so. Has Lowe move another station. Now this is really stretching Lowe's ability to support 3 major stations, constant observations. The aeronauts that he's hired to work with, and Allen is really at the Mechanicsville station, is just doing a tremendous job, but they are just absolutely exhausted. And of course, it rains in this country. And during an enormous rainstorm, the Chickahominy swells. And it's clear at this time, now that Lee is running the Army, that it's now time to take action because more than half of McClellan's army is on one side of the Chickahominy. And if we move out, on the Mechanicsville Road out of Richmond over to Mechanicsville. We can attack Porter's Corps there, which was then an unequal battle because the Confederates were probably equal, maybe even more in numbers. Not very many battles were there more in number, but this is the best shot that they're going to have of being able to perhaps overpower Porter. So the Battle of Mechanicsville, the Union calls it, or the Confederates called it. It's also called the Battle of excuse me. Here is the balloon station, and Allen is in charge of the balloon. But in this particular case, even though the gas generators are set up in this ravine by the Cosby farm area, the balloon is way out front. And just before the battle starts, Allen has his men send him up, and as he goes up several hundred feet, he then sees the advancing Confederate army. Now there's skirmishers out front on the balloon, and he orders the balloon to be brought down, and he's fired on immediately. And the shooting is quite hot and heavy. The artillery is coming at him. He is very scared now, and he makes a decision that he needs to get out of the balloon. They're not bringing the balloon down fast enough. So Allen gets out of the basket and glides down one of the guide ropes. And from a Confederate point of view, it looks like they shot an aeronaut out of the sky. That hits the Southern papers all over the place, that they killed an aeronaut. But they didn't. You know, Allen was very comfortable at heights. He could easily do that. It wasn't a problem for him. And of course he came down and immediately left the battlefield and left the 20th Massachusetts, who were there to help him, take the balloon out of the way. And they did, but they lost two men. One was shot by the advancing Confederate army, and another one was captured. So these were detailed men that were also risking their lives. But the balloon station was overrun, and the Battle of Beaver Dam Creek was certainly a Confederate victory. Not too long after that, Lee really wanted to have his own Air Force going. And so he acquired a balloon. He acquired a balloon that was built in Savannah. It was brought up and given to him. It was made of dressed silk. Okay, so dressed silk came from England, and they took these bolts of silk and fashioned what they needed to for panels of the balloon and sewed them together and coated them also with a varnish to keep them airtight. And this aeronaut, who is Porter Alexander, one of also Lee's favorite men. He's been on Lee's staff, also been chief of ordnance, and very well known throughout the war. He is assigned to be the aeronaut of it. And Porter's pretty fearless. This was okay with him. And this balloon was called the silk dress balloon because it had all these different colors and patches of silk that were sewn together. In fact, there is believed to be at least 40 different patterns of silk that were used. So it's really quite a spectacular balloon. And they made the decision that they were going to fill it at the local Richmond Gas Works. And here it is. It's still standing. You can see Fullerton Gas right there. And the train tracks go right by it. And so Lee had a train with a flat car come up. They filled the balloon, and they then ran the balloon down the peninsula and tethered the balloon, and Porter would launch off the balloon, off the train, off this flat car, and make his own observations. And so many cases, Lowe would have his two balloons, one at Gaines Mill and also one at Trent House, looking at Porter while they're looking at each other's lines. So it was really an exciting time for the ballooning that occurs. It never happened again in the war, having so many balloons in the air like that, both Confederate and Union. Well, what was happening, of course, is Lee was beginning the 7 days battles, and he was deciding once again to use that same strategy of hitting McClellan on the north side of the Chickahominy And that means the next balloon station that he's going to overrun is indeed the one at Gaines Mill. And in fact, he does that. Lowe realizes that almost too late. They try to pull the gas generators and all the balloons out of Gaines Mill, but they couldn't pull everything out, and 2 gas generators were left behind. And there's a number of letters and things in diaries that talk about the Wilcox's group, the Alabama Brigade, walking right by the gas works as they go down this valley and up and form a line into an enormous battle of Gaines Mill, which is almost the 150th anniversary of that battle. The Civil War Trust is in the process, I'll just mention, of purchasing the land in yellow, and this is the first land that they've purchased that will have a balloon station, a balloon site at Gaines Mill. Now, in the meantime, of course, at Gaines Mill, there's an enormous battle. It was a Confederate victory. The Union Army finally crossed the Chickahominy River over several bridges, and now McClellan is forced with the idea of being cut off from the York River. He needs to move his base of operation indeed to the James River, and he does so, but he's moving so rapidly over to the James, the balloons are packed up, moved with him, and they're not brought out until after many of those battles, the 7-day battles. But by the time he gets to Harrison's Landing, right on the Berkeley plantation here, that's when the balloons can come back and be used. And so the next balloon station is at Harrison's Landing. In the meantime, the Confederate balloon, the silk dress balloon, also called the Lady Davis, by the way, by many of the servicemen, was making observations right and left and reporting back to McClellan. And in one of those times, in fact, several of those times, Porter had the balloon towed by a vessel called the Teaser, and in fact convinced the Davidson, the captain of the Teaser, to run him down the James River at a particular location that he could embark and go report to Lee what he had seen. And so he made some observations, packed up the balloon, left it on the Teaser, and unfortunately the Teaser ran aground. And while they were waiting for the tides, around the corner comes the Monitor and the Maritanza. And the Maritanza takes several shots at the Teaser. Everyone on the Teaser decides we got to get out of here. And they're no match, certainly, for the Monitor, nor the Maritanza. And they abandon ship, and the Union Army ends up with the silk dress balloon. And this is given to Lowe. It's brought back, given to Lowe. And here's actually a picture from the Smithsonian collection. And you can see these little squares. Well, those squares were where Lowe cut sections of the balloon out, handed it to congressmen and reporters, and badmouthed the Confederate balloons and how his balloons were so much superior, and really used it to his advantage publicly. But Lowe ends up with malaria and is so bad off that he is shipped back to Philadelphia. In the meantime, McClellan and Lincoln go back and forth, and the decision is made that you're going to bring your troops home. And so that means he's got to figure out a way back. Well, the way back is, of course, the James River, or walk back the way he came, back to Yorktown and back to Fortress Monroe. And so before he does that, he wants to know if it's clear. And so he has James Allen in the Intrepid on the G.W. Parke Custis, towed down the James River to recon, to determine how safe it was to go and leave this particular area via the James River. And of course, although they fire cannons and do a few things based on some of the embankments that were there and fortifications, Fort Powhatan was fired on, the Confederates really weren't in mass. And so McClellan then indeed could ship his wounded out of this area via the James River, and then march his army back into the peninsula. So that ends the Peninsula Campaign. But the balloons were actually used in several other campaigns, like at Fredericksburg and at Chancellorsville, and actually provided pretty good service in many different ways. But also what was happening was Lowe's pay was cut. These were becoming, the Balloon Corps was being managed now by the Signal Corps was taken out of the topographical engineers, and a union officer by the name of Comstock was put in charge, and he was a real hard driving civil servant, and Lowe and he did not get along, so Lowe quit. So once that happened, there was no big advocate for the balloons, and at the end of the Chancellorsville campaign, the balloons were pulled out of Virginia, out of Chancellorsville, brought back by the quartermaster's department. They didn't know what to do with them, so instead, Lowe would have told them where to put them and what to do, but instead he wasn't there. And so they put him in a warehouse. They put him in one of the government warehouses. And of course, this is my vision of what that would look like. It's the Raiders of the Lost Ark. That's where they were stored. And they stayed in storage for about a year until it was decided by a young clerk that he needed space. And so he wrote his commander that he had all this balloons and balloon equipment, and the balloons were rotting. They were being destroyed by sitting in storage. That turns out not to be true. But that worked great because his supervisor said, well, we got to get our money out of it, so let's put them on auction. And within 2 weeks after he sent that memo to his supervisor, an ad came out. Here's an ad in the Washington Evening Star that they were going to have an auction not very far from the White House at an auction site, selling all the balloons, and all 7 balloons and gas generators, and fixtures, and everything ended up being sold. Lowe came down from Philadelphia, and he bought at least the Washington. He may have even bought the United States. We're not quite sure of that. But that ended the Balloon Corps. But what did it really do? Well, in many ways, it can observe the Confederate Army, and the Confederates could observe the Union Army up to 15 miles. It really kept Washington safe. A lot of the reporters would report what came from the balloons on a constant basis. Made well over 3,000 flights. Made extensive maps. Many officers went up. Topographical engineers went up. Made beautiful maps that were used by the Army. Experienced officers went up all the time. They reconnoitered and made decisions on what they did. Stoneman actually used the observations very effectively on a couple occasions to use his cavalry to bust up a couple things on the Peninsula campaign. And the balloons were used in the advance, but they were also used in the retreat for reconnaissance. As the balloons were pulled out of Chancellorsville and brought back, Hooker's army was coming back into the D.C. area. Hooker left the balloons in the rear guard, and that brought him information of how far the Confederates were behind him and whether they were attacking his rear. So that ended the Balloon Corps, but could the balloons have hastened the end of the war? Well, as a young technology, they weren't used very effectively. The generals didn't really know what to do with the information, couldn't put it in the context of a number of other types of intelligence they were getting. And so it was just a young technology that was hard to figure out how to use it effectively in a new theater, and that theater, of course, was the Civil War. However, had the balloons been in operation when Grant and Lee were in Petersburg and the trench warfare around Richmond, they could have provided invaluable service of looking at troop movements, where the weak lines were, and I would believe that that 9-month siege around Petersburg would not have lasted nearly as long. So let me finally say, the enjoyment of a Civil War-like balloon ride is here today. You know, you had amateurs, professionals that run with these higher balloons, just do a fabulous job of getting you up to about 1,000 feet. You can really appreciate the beautiful weather. When you get up there, you don't hear a sound. Or sometimes you can hear sounds coming from the ground as if you're standing right next to people. It's just a fabulous opportunity to understand how these balloons, thinking back, could have been used in the Civil War. So I hope you take advantage of that someday and bring back a little of the history. Thank you very much.
Jim, we do want to get some questions, but I'd like to pass the microphone around if you have a question, so we can get it recording as well. You have a question?
Yes, are there any pieces of the balloons or the gondolas or the wagons that were used to fill up the balloons anywhere today?
Yeah, there's believed to be a piece of the Intrepid. It's actually over in Lee Hall. It's on loan, and if you want to take a look at it, please go over. It may or may not be the Intrepid, but it's certainly associated with the Balloon Corps. A lot of the Balloon Corps, when they deployed a balloon, they actually put out a ground cloth. And sometimes those ground cloths were older balloons. Lowell acquired several balloons. In fact, some of these early balloons, like what was called the Enterprise, was a really famous balloon that Lowell used. It was probably a ground cloth. And so they staked these ground cloths out, these balloons, and then inflated new balloons, the military balloons on top of them. And then when they left, they'd pull up the ground cloth, and then sometimes pieces would be stuck in the stakes. And there's several like that have been found. So there is one in the area that you can go look at. And as I said, maybe the Intrepid, and maybe a piece of the ground cloth, which could still be a balloon. Be the Intrepid, but it'd be a balloon. Yeah.
I believe hydrogen is highly flammable.
Yeah.
Were there ever any accidents, or did they know it was flammable?
Oh, they know it was flammable. In fact, one of the things that the detail men were trained right off the bat is no smoking anywhere near them. And in fact, if they weren't minding the tethers of the balloon to get it up, they were on picket duty to keep anyone away from it that was smoking. And actually, there's quite a fascinating story about 6 Confederate soldiers that were tasked by Joe Johnston to knock out one of the balloons by going over there and trying to blow it up. And those 6 came across the York line, several of them dressed up as 4th Maine, and they were captured and they were shot. And out of the 6, only one had lived to tell the story. So they weren't able to do that. One got pretty close, but they weren't able to do that. But they wanted to destroy the balloons, and that didn't happen. Now, out of the 3,000 flights that were made, there was one accident, and it happened during the Chancellorsville campaign. Hooker wanted observations no matter what, and there was an enormous storm going on with huge winds. James Allen had his brother, Ezra Allen, another fabulous aeronaut, come down. They were from Providence, Rhode Island, so Lowe hired Ezra. And Ezra was assigned to go up into Washington and make this observation. So they played out 1,000 feet, and the balloon was like at 500 feet. The wind was so strong that it just literally blew this balloon down there. And then finally it got to the point where the wind ripped the seam, one of the seams in the Washington, right up, right from one end to the other, and of course the gas just immediately escaped. But the 4th Maine was also on the lines, and they saw what was going on, and so they ran upwind. And so instead of the balloon coming down like this, it actually came down in an arc. And although it was a pretty violent crash, Ezra survived that, lived to tell about it. And they repaired the balloon and put it back into service. But that was the only accident. Now, many years later, the French had used balloons before, and they were developing an even bigger balloon core, and they wanted to use hydrogen, and they wanted to see what it would be like if it was hit with a shell. And so they took a balloon out after it was filled with hydrogen and fired at it and hit it and blew it up. And that ended that. They decided that wasn't a great idea anyway. So they knew it was flammable. It was a terrible thing to use. Could have been enormous accidents associated with it, but they made it through.
One more thing about General Custer.
Yeah.
You said he went up in the balloons an awful lot of times,
Yes,
many times. He was very comfortable with it. However, relay his story about the first time he went up.
Yeah. He was on Keyes' staff, I believe, at the time at Warwick Courthouse. And Custer, of course, is incredibly daring, unbelievably bold, you know, a really gutsy fighter, all through the Civil War. And of course, that carried on to the rest of his life, and is well known for that. And so I'm sure this was a challenge, and given the opportunity, he wanted to go up in the balloon. So he got in a basket with Alan, and up he went. And as they went up, he got so scared, he collapsed to the bottom of the basket. And he was hanging onto the basket. He would not get up. And Alan, you know, the commensurate aeronaut, was taunting him. You know, come on, wait, just get up here and look and see what's going on. And one of the responses that Custer said is, well, this basket, it's so flimsy, it's wicker. And so Alan decided to jump up and down in the basket to show him how safe it was. But Alan knew that the basket actually had metal support straps. But, you know, Custer didn't know that. But here he is, cowering in the corner, you know, General Custer, the man made of iron, you know, with all these guts, and he couldn't get up. And finally he did. Alan coaxed him up. And he then got to liking it and got over it. And that's really neat. We know that story because he wrote about it. He actually admitted that it went that way. Yes?
We know that the technology of photography was very young at this time, but it seems logical they would have wanted to try to take photographs from the balloons. Do you know if there were any attempts to do that?
Really good question. Finding a photograph from a balloon is the holy grail. So if you ask me what the holy grail in this business is, that's it. There's good reason to believe that they may have. All right? And here's how it goes. There was quite a bit of talk between Allen and Lowe that we ought to do some photography from the balloon. And one of the reasons why Lowe considered it is because Allen did it. A year later in Boston, the very first photograph taken from a balloon was done by King and Allen. And Allen, as I said, was a commensurate, just an aeronaut all his life. He was in Providence, Rhode Island, but he was in Boston Common, and with balloons all the time. And so they set up, King went up with a photographer. King was his partner. Allen didn't go up, but they set everything up and went up, and you can go on to Wikipedia and you can say the first balloon picture, and there is a beautiful picture of Boston, you know, several row houses made in 1859, maybe 58, somewhere around that. But Allen did that. You know, Allen was involved in that, so he was ready to go. Now, we believe the time period between when Lowe ends up with malaria and goes back and Allen is in charge is when the photographs would have been taken. And the reason why is when the balloon equipment was pulled out of Harrison's Landing, and there's a tally of everything, and a number of balloons and wagons and sulfuric acid and all that. There's a whole series of photographic equipment that was there. So Allen was in the process of doing that. And so if there was a time, that was the perfect time for him to pull that off. But we can find no evidence. Just like the Holy Grail.
Any more questions?
It's not a question, but it's a comment. I had a great uncle that was in the Civil War, and he was at Chancellorsville. And he was wounded there, survived the wounds, and went back into service, but later died in Richmond in the hospital there in dysentery, I think. But anyway, he probably saw those balloons. It's fascinating
absolutely.
to have heard you say that the balloons were used in Chancellorsville.
Oh, yeah. And actually quite effectively. One of Lowe's balloons was set up across from Fredericksburg. And the early part of the battle, Early was down in the trenches, or the sunken road in Fredericksburg, holding off the Union Army. Well, they weren't charging, they weren't going to take that area. But from the balloon, when Early was ordered to move back, to fall back, that was noticed immediately. And that information went to Sedgwick, I believe, and then they actually stormed the area right away. And had that information been a little bit more timely, they might have done more damage in Early's case. But Early had to fall back very quickly because of that. It's also not verified, but there's some tantalizing glimpses that this may have occurred, that from one of the balloons they saw Jackson's maneuver. You know, Jackson at least split his army a couple of times at Chancellorsville. One of them was the big split where Jackson come around and go south and then west and then come back east and hit Hooker's army in a very unusual location, a complete surprise, overran them and brought them all the way back through Chancellorsville area and really rolled them up. It's believed that the balloons saw that. One of the things that Lowe wanted to do, now the balloons weren't anywhere near Chancellorsville, they're sitting on the other side of the Rappahannock, sorry, on the Fredericksburg side. One of the things Lowe wanted to do was to set up a series of flag systems that, okay, he's making observations, we'll drop some flags and you can read them and that will give you intelligence, but Hooker didn't want to mess with that. That would have been perfect, because if they did see that movement, which I believe they did, they may not have known that he was coming back, but there is indications that they saw the movement. That could have alerted him in some way, but didn't happen.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What was the ground level buoyancy of these big balloons? And how did they recover them? Did they vent hydrogen or did they muscle them back?
They would either muscle them back, they wouldn't vent them. Once you filled them with hydrogen, you wanted to keep them inflated. So they would muscle them back, or they would use what's called a windlass, which is a big machine that you could roll up the line on and bring the balloons down. They needed to do that quite quickly because, as they got to a point where the shells were coming out, the Confederates were seeing, okay, it's coming down. We're going to be ready for them. That's really the most danger was coming down. So they had various techniques to get them down very fast. Then they would throw netting over them. And then from that netting, either use stakes or they would use sandbags or some sort of weights to then harbor the balloon as close to the ground as they could, and then take the basket off. And they would store it that way for a little while. But the balloons were still used. Even at night, Lowe would go up at night. I mean, these aeronauts would go up for 8 or 9, 10 hours at a time. And at night they would go up. And at night what they would do is they would count the campfires. Okay? Because, you can get a campfire, you can get 10 men around it. Okay, so there's 10, 20, 30, 40. You can count the campfires and get an estimate of how many men were there and where they were. But what was happening, the reporters were with Lowe all the time. Lowe loved reporters. He fed their horses and fed them too, just to keep them around. And they wrote wonderful stories. I've read over 2,000 stories in newspapers from reporters that Lowe brought along with him. So the reporters would talk about his night escapades that end up in the New York Times, and a day or so later, and 2 days later, Lee's reading them. Okay? I'm going to order no campfires over this site. The Confederates are going to freeze their butt off. But that's what we're going to do. So, they didn't know how to manage intelligence even. It was terrible, Lowe loved the newspaper articles, but it was going against really good intelligence management. In fact, at one time, McClellan got so upset with it, he ordered no reporters near the balloons on the Peninsula campaign, the latter part of the Peninsula campaign. Yes, ma'am.
I just wondered, did anyone try to shoot from the balloons, or did anyone try to shoot the balloons down?
Yeah, they tried to shoot at the balloons constantly, all the time. The balloons made about 3,000 flights, and probably 2/3 of them were very dangerous because of being shelled at. But there's no record that anyone went up in a balloon and fired back. There's just no record. Nor is there any record that they took bombs up and then dropped them. They felt that was just too dangerous to do. The free flights were, it's a real chance effort. You really had to be an extraordinary aeronaut or as lucky as Porter was to survive the free flights, to even fly over Confederates to drop bombs. So that just wasn't going to happen. But they were talked about. You know, those ideas were there. And so by World War I, they became a mainstay of what would happen next. Yes?
Two questions. You were talking about the aeronauts going up and staying for like 8 hours or so. How did they...
Don't take a lot of water.
Yeah, but during that time, how was the intelligence taken back down?
Okay. They would write notes, put it in a bullet, and then attach it to a line that's designed to be dropped. So the message would ride down a guide wire, and then a scout would pick it up, a courier rather, would pick it up, would read the message, and then carry it over to where it needed to go for the intelligence to be processed and understood, etc. What a lot of these generals didn't do was give specific orders of what they wanted to see, what intelligence they needed next. And so when you get up in a balloon, man, everything is available to you. What's going on over here may not matter to the general. May look neat, may look interesting. He might be more concerned about what's happening over there. So they didn't use that very well. They did a couple techniques. One, they took an artist or two up with them, and so the artist would map the region out, you know, and then they would put numbers on the map. And so the messages they would go is Section 5, more artillery is being brought in. Section 3, the tents are being taken down. Section 8, you know, the Confederates were abandoning. Whatever it happened to be, they'd write these little coded things. But that's how they communicated to the ground. Many times they used telegraph, but not always. They didn't always have the telegraph operators. Lowe had telegraph equipment with him, but he needed the telegraph operators assigned to him. He was never assigned a permanent telegraph operator. That had to come from the Signal Corps. The Signal Corps hated the balloons. They hated the balloons because they're taking their job away. Okay? And so since the balloons were never part of the Signal Corps until late in the war, there was a constant battle between these two sections of the forces. Who would have thought, right? No, it happens even today.
One more question.
Sure.
Gosh, I'm almost forgetting now. Gosh, I forgot what I was going to ask you.
What do you think about it?
What do you think about it?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. I'm interested in the term aeronaut. It's very interesting. We have astronaut today,
yes,
and we've been using the term aeronaut.
Yes.
I'm interested in the lexicon of that. Was that a term of the day, or was that something that was brought over from France or other places? How did that term come about?
It happened early on. Who did it, how it did it, how they came up with it, I'm not familiar with. And I had been asked this earlier this week, and I should have followed up with it. Or I've been able to answer your question. But Tom Crouch for sure knows, who's a curator up at the Air and Space Museum, and was here last week, last month. Yeah, and hopefully he answered it. But I will find out from Tom, and send me your email, and I'll let you know what the answer is.
All right, thanks a lot. I can go to the web and probably get the answer myself.
Not true. But I go to the expert. Okay, just to be clear, what's on the web isn't always it.
That's true. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll go to Tom Crouch. He'll know.
Okay, one last question.
This is more of a comment than a question. It's been several years since I was in high school and read about the Civil War and was taught about the Civil War. But there was no mention of balloons. And then I also watched the Ken Burns series on the Civil War. And I don't remember...
well, he had a little bit in it.
He
did a little bit.
But I didn't know that there were so many flights, you know.
Yeah, I know. I know.
And so
True.
this is almost like that's a lost thing as far as,
Well, hopefully it won't be lost for too long. I just keep talking, I guess.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Jim? As you can tell, Jim's not passionate about the subject at all. I've had the honor of spending the last day and last evening with him, and he's about as less passionate about it as Tom Crouch, who was here back in March, that spoke up in Williamsburg down here too. So we certainly appreciate you coming, Jim. We have a little gift for you. As usual, you know, a lot of the events here in Yorktown, it doesn't, one organization or one person certainly doesn't do it. Historical committee is taking the host of this event. But the museum, Bonnie from the museum, helped organize a luncheon today that we all enjoyed very much. Enjoyed being with you with this today. The Centennial Committee, of course, we've had events going since 2009, and we're going to continue, and we remind you to look at that program and look at the events for next week. But we have a small gift coming from the Historical Museum. To our knowledge, we're the only organization in the United States that's created a medallion honoring the W3R, the Washington Rochambeau route. And even though it's a little bit out of context, we want to put Jim one as a small token of our appreciation.
My pleasure. Thank
you very much. Thank you very much for coming. Please, if Jim will stay around for a few minutes, he'll certainly entertain questions you have. And we encourage you to come back next weekend because we have lots of neat things. One of the real neat things that we did through Jim and also Dr. Crouch, we made a contact with a company in Northern Virginia that came out on April 7th down in the Marlbeck area and put up a real helium balloon, modern day balloon. And we were able to get photographs from the Marlbeck area of York County, and that's where Thaddeus Lowe actually launched a lot of his balloons from. So we were able to get photographs, a 360, 180 view of Yorktown area from 500 feet in the Marlbeck area, very close to where they actually did it during the Civil War. And so we would welcome you to come see that. Hopefully we'll be able to show you that next week. We also want to introduce Kristen, Jim's wife is back there in the back. She was able to join us today. We enjoyed meeting her. Thank you, Chris, for coming, Kristen. Okay, anybody have anything else?
Sunday.
Sunday. One more thing. Michael Moore from the curator of Lee Hall Mansion at the Plantation is going to be here talking about the Peninsula Campaign. And if you've never seen Michael talk, he's excellent. He's very animated. Has lots of humorous stories that he mixes in, but he's probably one of the foremost authorities on the Peninsula Campaign around here too. So we welcome you to come back on Sunday at 3 o'clock in this room, and we certainly welcome you to come back. Thank you a lot. Have a good evening.